For decades, the crime of rape has been known as the easiest criminal allegation to make by the alleged victim and the hardest to disprove by the defendant. In the 1960s, the victims of this brutal crime were able to take advantage of significant changes in the law that made it easier to obtain convictions and justice. Unfortunately, these changes also made it easier for those who were falsely accused of rape to be convicted. Adding to the defendant's difficulty is the controversial rape trauma syndrome. This is a psychological theory that has been rejected by behavioral scientists. Unfortunately, this idea is still being used by prosecutors and junk science witnesses as so-called evidence in cases against defendants accused of the crime of rape. A series of biased laws are making it easier to obtain convictions. Let me tell you a little bit about them. First, jury instructions are the law that is read to the jury. Courts have long known that rape is an easy allegation to make, but one that is hard to disprove. In fact, the biggest threat of being falsely accused of a crime was that of being accused of rape, until child molestation became a significant national issue, flooding the legal system with cases. It is now the most likely false allegation. Courts perceive the potential threat of false allegations of rape and fashion jury instructions to inform members of the jury that such allegations were easy to be made and difficult to disprove. But today, in most states, this jury instruction is no longer allowed. In many states, the judge now informs the jury that 1. An allegation of rape does not require any evidence of corroboration. 2. There is no requirement for medical evidence. 3. There is no requirement for DNA evidence. And 4, there is no requirement for a second witness. In short, the only requirement for a conviction is the bare allegation made by a complainant. Even the manner in which the jury is selected is tainted with this attitude that evidence doesn't matter. In many states, prosecutors can demand that during jury selection, each prospective juror must agree that he would not require corroboration to find a crime. If the juror disagrees with this demand, he or she can be excused. Then we have the rape shield laws. Consensual sex is still illegal. Being able to prove consent, however, has become more difficult for the defendant. For example, if a man meets a woman at a bar and has sex with her that night, and later she claims she was raped, the man used to be able to introduce evidence to help establish a pattern of consensual sexual behavior on the woman's part. That might be the testimony by witnesses that the woman routinely came to the bar every night, engaged the man's companionship, and went home and had sexual relations with him. Such evidence is relevant to show the sex on the night in question was consensual, but it's not admissible. Victims' rights advocates were rightly concerned with the legal strategies that put the victim's personal life on trial. Unfortunately, highly relevant evidence that could have protected an innocent defendant is no longer allowed because politics has obscured justice and powerful lobbies have helped to pass what is now called rape shield laws. Under these rape shield laws, a defendant in today's courtroom is forbidden from introducing the prior consensual conduct of the complainant on the issue of consent. Curiously, no one has successfully shown that the evidence of prior sexual conduct is not relevant in determining consent. While the rape shield laws were intended to encourage more women to come forward and testify, they simply have made it easier to falsely accuse and convict an innocent individual. Many states also allow the prosecution to introduce allegations made by other women allegedly assaulted on previous occasions by the defendant to prove that a rape occurred in the current charged offense. In these circumstances, no corroborating evidence is required to introduce these alleged crimes. There does not even have to be a conviction, nor does there even have to exist a criminal charge or even a police report. The uncorroborated word of a single individual is sufficient. As you can see, many state legislators are creating new victims by keeping out the sexual history of the complainant on the issue of consent, but allowing into evidence the sexual history of the defendant. This is sheer politics and not based upon relevancy or fair play. This kind of legislation is systematically making it easier to obtain convictions, and while those guilty of rape should be convicted, those who are falsely accused should be allowed to defend themselves adequately in court. Next, let's look at the rape trauma syndrome. The members of the jury are the trier of fact. They hear the account of the complainant, and if the defendant elects to testify, they hear the testimony of the defendant. This is a classic she said, he said situation, in which jury members must decide who is telling the truth. In an attempt to provide greater credibility of the complainant and thereby tip the scales of justice in favor of conviction, Ann Burgess and Lynn Holstrom wrote a psychological description of what they termed the rape trauma syndrome. This was written in 1974. A true syndrome is a constellation of symptoms that, when presented by an individual, leads to a diagnosis of an illness. First of all, rape trauma syndrome is not really a syndrome because no diagnosis can be made from the syndrome. Secondly, there was no scientifically controlled study done by behavioral science professionals that supports the theory of rape trauma syndrome. The fact that this highly questionable theory is not even recognized in the DSM, 3, 2, 1. The fact is that this highly questionable theory is not recognized in the DSM-4. The DSM-4 is a diagnostic and statistical manual of the American Psychiatric Association and is the current group of recognized diagnoses by behavioral science professionals. It includes all the current recognized diagnoses and recognized syndromes. Rape trauma syndrome is not in this DSM-4 because it was rejected by the behavioral science community, psychiatrists, psychologists, clinical social workers, and others. One reason the rape trauma syndrome is unscientific is that Burgess and Holstrom assumed that any allegation of rape was true and, on that foundation, devised an explanation of whatever the alleged victim might say or do. It seems their rape trauma explanation does not constitute a description of symptoms of an illness, but rather a way of manipulating evidence in favor of a complainant. For example, if a woman recants her story and admits that she was not raped and that she lied, the prosecution can put on a supposed rape trauma expert on the stand to say that this is behavior that rape victims demonstrate repeatedly. The implication is that the original rape story should be believed and the admission of lying should not. This demonstrates why we refer to the rape trauma syndrome as confirmatory bias. It's a confirmatorily bias-based description. What is meant is that the syndrome demonstrates a built-in bias toward confirming that a rape happened. In fact, it essentially assumes that a rape happened. In a process like this, all symptoms lead to the conclusion that it happened, consistent with testimony from the prosecution experts, usually illustrates this confirmatory bias. Our office has never witnessed a so-called rape trauma expert testify that the complainant's behavior is also consistent with false allegations of rape. This is true even though it is widely known and accepted by legitimate researchers in the behavioral sciences. Other descriptions found in the rape trauma syndrome literature explain that if a woman immediately reports, such action is consistent with the typical reaction of a rape victim. Curiously, the same so-called rape trauma syndrome information explains that if a woman waits for years to report, that is also consistent with a typical reaction of a rape victim. The rape trauma syndrome literature, folks, also explain that if a woman is flirtatious, such behavior is consistent with the typical reaction of a rape victim. But if the woman is withdrawn, that too is consistent with the typical reaction of a rape victim. Should the woman cry when testifying, that behavior is consistent with the reaction of a rape trauma victim. But if a woman doesn't cry while testifying, that is also consistent with being a typical reaction of a rape victim. The list of descriptions covers almost every conceivable behavior that a human being might have over the course of a lifetime. As you see, this makes any behavior evidence support the charge of an alleged rape.